Hello everyone, tonight we're diving straight into the world's most painful traditions, where becoming an adult meant bleeding, burning, or, if you were really unlucky, being buried alive. From boys in the Amazon shoving their hands into gloves packed with venomous bullet ants, to widows in India expected to climb onto their husband's funeral pyre, to warriors on the plains of North America tearing free from hooks lodged in their own chests. It's safe to say you probably wouldn't make it past the first round. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy hearing about humanity's worst ideas for self-improvement. Otherwise, no pressure. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time of day is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating how these strange stories travel across the globe, landing in living rooms, night shifts, or sleepless 3 a.m. wanderings. So, settle in, maybe dim the lights, pour some tea, let the hum of your fan or the silence of your room wrap around you. And let's step together into a world where pain wasn't an accident of life, it was the doorway to meaning. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one sipping coffee right now, scrolling absent-mindedly, but the one crouched under a torchlit sky in ancient Mesoamerica, holding a stingray spine and debating whether you'd prefer to poke your tongue, your ears, or well, the parts of your anatomy. You see, in that world, your blood wasn't just yours, it was spiritual currency, the rent payment for occupying a body on Earth. And if you thought paying taxes in cash was painful, imagine paying in droplets of your own veins. Among the Maya elite, there was no such thing as a private life. You couldn't just quietly exist. You were expected to feed the gods. And feeding didn't mean a polite offering of fruit or incense. No, it meant bloodletting, the slow and deliberate opening of your flesh so that the gods could snack on the very thing that kept you upright. Tongues, ears, lips, those were the usual suspects. But sometimes, the ritual called for a little more drama. Male nobles, in particular, liked to pierce the foreskin with obsidian blades or stingray spines. Yes, stingray spines, nature's hypodermic needles. They bled into bark paper, burned it, and let the smoke rise to the heavens like a cosmic receipt. Here you go, gods, proof of payment. You might be imagining yourself whimpering, but no, that wasn't allowed. Pain had to be endured with the face of someone politely nodding through a bad dinner party. To grimace, to flinch, to bleed, and look uncomfortable. That was social bankruptcy. Your calmness showed devotion, control, and a frankly terrifying tolerance for tetanus. And this wasn't just a Maya quirk. The Aztecs carried the same obsession, only bigger, louder, bloodier. In their worldview, the sun itself needed blood to keep moving across the sky. Think of it as cosmic fuel. Without enough human blood spilled, morning wouldn't come. Imagine waking up every day knowing the sunrise was entirely dependent on how many volunteers or unwilling volunteers got poked, cut, or sacrificed the night before. Forget coffee, the gods drank red. The practice spread in quieter forms elsewhere too. In Papua New Guinea, some highland groups believed childhood dirt needed to be expelled. Boys had their noses pierced and bled deliberately, the blood running out like an unpleasant spring cleaning of the body. Out with the childish impurities, in with adult vigor. If you survived the ordeal without fainting or vomiting, congratulations, you were now socially useful. What's striking is how little any of this was symbolic. Modern rituals often trade in metaphor. Break a glass to symbolize luck, cut a cake to symbolize unity, light a candle to symbolize hope. Ancient blood rituals weren't playing around with symbols. They genuinely believed your blood carried life force, and that life force was negotiable property. You could literally hand it over. You could burn it, spill it, smoke it, or even smear it across idols. Your veins were the pantry for the gods' eternal hunger. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive it. Most of us today faint at the sight of a flu shot. Imagine kneeling on temple steps, carving into your flesh while a priest leaned in, sniffing incense, and reminding you to bleed more beautifully. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, at least that was a one-time thing, you're in for disappointment. Because once you'd given your blood, they'd ask for something more permanent. Not liquid, but carved into your skin. Not passing pain, but lifelong evidence etched in scars. And now that your blood has been drained, let's imagine they didn't stop there. Because why waste all that good pain on one night when you could carry it forever, stitched into your very skin? Welcome to the world of scarification where the body became a diary. Only the ink was ash rubbed into open wounds, and the pen was a razor. If you'd been born in certain parts of West or Central Africa a century ago, you wouldn't have had the luxury of deciding whether to get a tattoo of a small bird on your ankle at 19 because you felt like expressing yourself. No, your community expressed itself on you. Each cut was a sentence, each raised scar a paragraph of your identity. Clan, age, beauty, maturity, all spelled out in flesh. And don't think you could refuse. To be smooth-skinned was to be invisible, incomplete, even suspicious. You might as well have walked around wearing a sign that said, "Not really one of us." The procedure itself, pain designed with artistry. A blade, sometimes a sharp stone, sliced shallow lines into your chest, arms or face. Then came the ash, or sometimes clay, or plant-based pigments, rubbed into the wounds so the scars would rise thick and proud. Infection, that was a risk. Pain, that was the point. You didn't cry, you transformed. Each flinchless moment proved your readiness for adulthood. Each scar announced, "I survived. I belong. And also, yes, I'm technically a walking relief sculpture." In some groups, like the Dinka of Sudan, scarification on the forehead created distinctive patterns. 6 or more deep cuts across the brow marked the passage into manhood. Imagine your entire adolescence condensed into one brutal session, with a knife across your face. No speeches, no graduation caps, just a permanent crown carved into your skin. You didn't walk away with a diploma, you walked away with a literal mark of courage. And scars weren't always about men. Women too underwent scarification, often on their torsos, breasts or stomachs. The raised patterns were seen as beauty, as erotic art. Pain created allure, and scars became the sensual currency of attraction. Your suffering didn't just prove you were strong, it proved you were desirable. You see, in societies where survival required resilience, beauty wasn't about symmetry or Photoshop filters. Beauty was endurance, visibly displayed. Elsewhere, branding played the same role. Hot irons pressed to the skin left indelible marks, sometimes in initiation, sometimes in punishment. Either way, your flesh became the billboard of your social fate. Imagine enduring that sizzling pain and then having to nod politely when someone remarked how majestic the pattern looked as you tried not to pass out. It's hard to overstate how communal the act was. Scarification ceremonies weren't private ordeals. They were public theater, group pain, with everyone watching. Elders looked on, not to comfort you, but to measure whether you flinched. Children looked on, knowing their time would come. And you just tried to breathe steadily as blood trickled down. Flies circled, and ash burned in the cuts. Because endurance was the definition of personhood. And if you're wondering how you'd fare, probably not. Well, most of us today complain when a mosquito bite itches for an hour. Imagine deliberately inviting 10, 20, or 50 such wounds all at once, then letting them fester into art. But even if you did endure, your suffering wasn't finished. Because scars could only show you belonged. They didn't prove you were tough enough to lead, or fierce enough to fight, or worthy enough to be called an adult in the fullest sense. For that, you needed to give up not just blood and skin but bone, specifically, your teeth. So, you've bled, you've scarred, and now you think you've earned a rest. Not even close. Because in some societies, the real proof of your transformation wasn't written in cuts across your skin, but carved into the smile you no longer had. Welcome to the delightful world of ritual tooth removal, where adulthood was celebrated by yanking perfectly healthy teeth from your mouth with stone tools. Let's say you'd been born among the Dinka in Sudan. Childhood ended the moment someone sat you down, steadied your head, and drove a chisel or knife into your lower jaw to knock out 6 front teeth. Not rotten ones, not crooked ones, perfectly fine ones, gone in a session of clumsy dentistry that made medieval barbers look gentle. And here's the kicker. Anesthesia wasn't part of the vocabulary. Your pain was the point. Every crack of tooth and spurt of blood was a statement that you'd stepped into the world of men. In some cases, the teeth were removed because of spiritual belief that without it, you remained impure or unfit. In other cases, it was about beauty. A gapped smile became the emblem of identity, a signature of belonging. Without it, you weren't considered part of the community. Refuse the ritual, and you weren't just childish, you were socially defective. Australia had its own variations. Among many Aboriginal groups, adolescent boys had front teeth knocked out with stone tools as initiation. Imagine kneeling before your elders while one of them positioned a sharp stone against your upper incisor. Then another brought down a wooden mallet. Crack, the sound of adulthood ringing through your skull. If you whimpered, if you shook, you didn't just disgrace yourself, you disgraced your entire family. Pain was the language everyone understood. And this wasn't limited to knocking teeth out. In other societies, teeth were deliberately filed 2 points, chipped, or reshaped with primitive tools. The Mangbetu of Central Africa, for instance, filed teeth into sharp triangular shapes that made you look like you'd auditioned for a vampire role centuries before cinema. Pain was beauty, and beauty was survival. Think about the daily aftermath. Eating, speaking, drinking, everything changed. Every sip of water stung. Every bite of food was a reminder. Infection was common. Death wasn't rare. But hey, at least you had the grin to prove you were one of them. And before you start feeling smug, consider how much of this isn't so different from what we still do. Orthodontics may be more sanitary, but teenagers still sit in chairs while strangers yank teeth, drill bone, and attach metal to gumsole in the name of belonging, beauty, and social approval. The difference? Your orthodontist at least gives you anesthesia and a payment plan. But back then, your endurance of tooth pulling was more than cosmetic. It was a trial of identity, a mark of courage, a blood-soaked smile flashing proof that you'd stepped over the line dividing child from adult. And once you'd given up pieces of your mouth, what else could they take from you? The answer, of course, was everything else. Because beyond the scars and the gaps in your teeth came the fire. Always the fire. And fire has a way of testing not just the body, but the soul itself. By now you've bled, you've scarred, you've smiled your toothless grin at the elders, and you think you've proven enough. But no, the universe, apparently, loves a bit of theater, and nothing says theater quite like fire. If blood was the down payment, and scars the receipt, then fire was the grand finale of your initiation. Proof you could stand in front of the gods and not flinch, while your skin cooked like festival meat. Take South Asia, for example. If you'd been born into a Tamil community devoted to Draupadi or Murugan, you might have found yourself staring at a trench of burning embers, being told oh so casually that today you'd be walking barefoot across it. Not as a dare, not as a party trick, but as a sacred duty. The coals weren't metaphorical. They were hot enough to roast you, and you weren't allowed to sprint across screaming either. No, you had to walk with dignity, steady and calm, like someone on a divine catwalk, while your souls blistered and smoked. Elsewhere, fire was less about walking and more about holding. In West Africa, there were trials by hot iron, accused of witchcraft. You didn't get a lawyer. You got a glowing piece of metal pressed to your palms. If your wounds healed cleanly, congratulations, you were innocent. If they festered or scarred badly, well, turns out you were a witch after all, and probably not long for this world. Imagine the stakes. Your skin literally on trial, court adjourned by third-degree burns, and don't assume this was confined to the past. Even in the modern Taipusam festival in parts of India and Malaysia, devotees walk across fire pits as acts of penance and devotion. Some carry heavy kavadi frames, adorned with hooks piercing their flesh, before crossing flames. The idea is purification, transcendence, proof that your body is just an instrument when the gods are watching you. You'd probably last one step before squealing, running, and thereby disqualifying yourself from both divine favor and community pride. But here's the part modern ears find hardest to grasp. This wasn't masochism. It wasn't self-torture for the sake of it. Fire was seen as divine witness. To walk through it or hold it was to show that your soul was clean, your devotion true, your heart aligned with cosmic order. Survive the ordeal without burns or, at least, without infection, and you walked away not just respected but elevated. Fail, and your body became the evidence against you. Picture it. The village gathered around, drums beating, incense burning, eyes fixed on you, a glowing iron rod placed in your hand, or a path of embers laid before your bare feet. There's no opting out. The ritual doesn't care that your instincts scream run. You stand there, sweating before you even begin, while elders murmur prayers and onlookers lean forward to see if you'll falter. Because faltering isn't just embarrassing, it's damning. And when it's done, when your skin hisses against fire, when you've walked across embers with the solemn calm of someone pretending not to smell their own burning flesh, you've earned your place. The scars are your diploma. The blisters are your proof. But if you thought fire was the limit, you're wrong. Because there were people who didn't just walk across flames or hold hot irons, they let sharp hooks pierce their flesh and lifted their entire bodies from the ground. And that, my friend, makes the fire look like a warm-up act. So you've walked through fire, your feet blistered like overcooked bread, and you think the gods have had their fun. But no. The next stage is where you discover that flesh was never really yours. It was a canvas, a tether, a pulley system. Because in certain traditions, devotion wasn't measured by how many prayers you whispered, but by how many holes you could put in your body without screaming. Take the Hindu festival of Thaipusam. You're a devotee of Lord Murugan, and devotion isn't about sitting quietly in a temple. It's about pain transformed into spectacle. Your cheeks, pierced through with skewers, your tongue, impaled until speech is impossible, because silence itself becomes offering. And your skin is punctured with hooks. Dozens of them, each one pulling at you, some tethered to heavy kavadi frames that tower above your head. Now, picture the procession. You're not sitting on the sidelines watching with popcorn. You are the parade float, barefoot, pierced, carrying the weight of gods and iron. Your body sways in trance to drum beats and chanting. Everyone around sees not just flesh but devotion incarnate. And here's the strange part. Many who endure it describe not agony but euphoria. A trance-like detachment where the body's pain dissolves. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It means you've surrendered to the rhythm, the gods, and possibly the adrenaline flooding your system. But Thaipusam is only one version. Across cultures, suspension rituals have appeared like stubborn weeds of human devotion. Among some Native American plains tribes, the sun dance included piercing the chest or back skin, then tethering initiates to poles. With thongs threaded through their flesh, dancers pulled until skin tore. Not symbolic tearing, actual tearing, blood dripping down dust as they spun in agony. This was offering sacrifice, proof of courage, a vision-seeking ordeal, not a performance. Even in modern revivalist groups worldwide, suspension has become a ritual of transcendence. Hooks driven through the back, participants lifted into the air, dangling from their skin like grotesque marionettes. It looks brutal, but for practitioners, it's described as liberating, ecstatic, a way to escape the limits of flesh by making flesh scream. You'd probably faint before the second hook went in. Because suspension isn't just about penitence, about staying there, about holding yourself upright, or dangling, while everyone watches and whispers about your courage, your purity, your willingness to endure. Its pain is proof, pain is theater, pain is cosmic language, and this isn't masochism in the modern sense. It isn't about pleasure, it's about transforming the body into an altar. Each wound becomes a prayer, each hook a vow, each drop of blood a bead of communication with the divine. You don't just believe, you prove belief by turning yourself into evidence. The irony, of course, is that the body you're proving divine through is the one most vulnerable, fragile, and breakable. Skin rips, muscle strains, blood seeps, infection lurks, and yet people stood or dangled through it all, convinced that endurance made them not just worthy, but holy. So yes, you might have survived the fire by sheer adrenaline, but the hooks, the piercings, the moment your own body weight tugged against your skin like gravity's cruelest joke, that's where you'd break, that's where you'd cry out. And crying out wasn't devotion, it was failure. But don't worry, if hanging from hooks doesn't suit you, there's always another initiation that makes needles look merciful. One where the pain comes not from metal but from creatures alive, writhing, and armed with stingers so powerful they can make grown men collapse. By now you've been pierced, burned, cut, and carved, and you might think you've seen the creative limit of human cruelty dressed up as devotion. But no, because in the Brazilian Amazon, the Sater. People devised an initiation so uniquely sadistic that it makes firewalking look like a warm bath. They decided adulthood wasn't official until you'd stuck your hands into woven gloves filled with dozens of live bullet ants. Yes, bullet ants. Not small, not cute, not polite, little creatures of the forest. These are Periponera clavata, giant ants, whose sting has been described by entomologist Justin Schmidt, who dedicated his life to being bitten by insects, because apparently therapy was too expensive as the most painful insect sting on Earth. He compared it to walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail driven into your heel. And he wasn't exaggerating. Victims of a single sting often collapse, sweat, hallucinate, or convulse. Now multiply that by hundreds, on both hands, at once. The ritual works like this. The ants are collected from the forest and first sedated with natural herbs. While they're unconscious, their bodies are woven into palm leaf gloves, stingers pointed inward like tiny poisoned daggers. When the ants wake up, furious and disoriented, you slide your hands inside, and then you dance. Not just once, either. You wear the gloves for about 10 minutes, while the ants sting repeatedly, flooding your nervous system with venom potent enough to cause temporary paralysis. Your body shakes, your vision blurs, your breathing falters, but you're not allowed to scream. You're not allowed to collapse. You're expected to endure with a calm dignity that only someone being electrocuted by 1,000 volts of biological venom could fake. And this isn't a one-off. To be considered a true warrior, a boy has to repeat the ordeal up to 20 times. 20 rounds of venom, pain, and hallucination before the elders nod approvingly and declare him ready. Think about that, while you were worrying about passing math exams. Boys in the Amazon were strapping their childhoods into ant-filled boxing gloves and offering their nerves to the gods of adulthood. The stings cause waves of pain that last for hours. Not sharp, not fleeting rolling, throbbing waves that spread through arms, chest, and spine. Muscles spasm, hands swell grotesquely, fevers spike. Some initiates faint, collapse into seizures, or wake up later in a haze of fire, still burning through their nerves. And when the swelling finally goes down, the scars remain as proof. Proof not just of suffering, but of belonging. Because here's the key. This isn't just masochism disguised as tradition. It's a contract. The boy doesn't suffer for himself. He suffers for his community. His ability to endure venom shows he can endure war, hardship, and the spiritual weight of manhood. If you can outlast the ant, you can outlast life. You, though, let's be honest, you'd have quit halfway through lacing the gloves. One ant sting, and you'd already be sprinting for antihistamines, screaming about allergic reactions. And the elders would shake their heads, whispering, "Not a warrior, not even close." But maybe ants don't frighten you. Maybe you think blood and venom are too primal, too insect-like. Don't worry, other cultures skipped the ants and went straight to whips. Not the playful kind. The kind designed to flay your back in public, while everyone else cheered your pain as holy. So you've survived the ants' Berlin. Your arms still feel like they've been plugged into a socket. You think that must be the worst of it. But in many cultures, the logic was simpler. Why outsource the pain to insects when humans are perfectly capable of beating themselves bloody? Welcome to flagellation, where the path to purity is paved with whips, chains, and the sound of flesh tearing like wet parchment. Take medieval Europe during the Black Death. Whole groups of men and women known as flagellants paraded through towns, shirtless, chanting hymns while whipping their own backs until the cobblestones ran red. The reasoning was elegant in its madness. The plague was God's punishment, so perhaps if they punished themselves hard enough, he'd call off the rats and fleas. You can picture it, dozens of pale, hysterical bodies, backs striped and dripping, marching through mud and incense smoke. A traveling carnival of guilt. If you'd been there, you wouldn't have had to look far to find religion. It was spattered across the streets in crimson streaks. But Europe didn't corner the market on self-laceration. In Shia Islam, during the commemoration of Ashura, some participants beat their chests rhythmically, while others strike their backs with chains, sometimes tipped with blades, to honor the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali. It's not spectacle for spectacle's sake. It's grief made visible, devotion hammered into the body, the kind of mourning you don't forget because you carry its scars forever. Travel to Latin America, Mexico, the Philippines, and you'll still see penitents during Holy Week, crawling on knees until they're raw, whipping themselves in public processions, sometimes even crucifying themselves with nails through hands and feet to reenact Christ's suffering. If modern religion tends toward symbolic fasting or giving up chocolate for Lent, these people went straight for bloodletting with a side of tetanus. The anthropological thread is the same. Pain as purification, suffering as solidarity with divine suffering, agony as evidence of sincerity. Because words are cheap, but blood on the ground, that's a signature no one can fake. And imagine yourself in that crowd. Would you pick up the whip, stripped to the waist, and lash your own back while neighbors nodded approvingly? Or would you, like most modern souls, manage one half-hearted slap before quietly limping away to buy bandages and apologize to your skin. The truth is, most of us today can't even tolerate sunburn without whining. These people whipped themselves raw on purpose and then came back for more. What's eerie is how communal it all was. You weren't suffering alone. You were synchronized, whipping in rhythm, a choir of pain echoing through plazas and streets. Each lash a hymn, each scar a verse. You didn't just share faith, you shared wounds, and it wasn't always voluntary. In some African initiation camps, boys were whipped by elders to toughen them. The trick wasn't surviving. That part was assumed. The trick was not flinching. You could bleed, you could bruise, but you could not cry. Tears marked you as weak. Silence made you a man. So picture yourself there, shoulders bare, whip in hand, crowd roaring, blood dripping. Would you keep swinging, or would you stop after 3 lashes, mutter, "That's enough holiness for today," and go find a cold stream to soak in? But if you thought whips were intimate, direct, and personal, some cultures went one step further. They tethered your skin to sacred poles and made you dance until it ripped. Whips only wrote scars. This next ritual tore prayers straight out of your flesh. If whips marked you, cutting finished you. Because in some traditions, it wasn't enough to bleed on the ground or scar on the surface. The gods or the community, or both, wanted more tangible proof. They wanted pieces of you. And so came the rituals where flesh itself was carved, pierced, tethered, and finally torn. Not as punishment, but as prayer. Let's go to the plains of North America. Among the Lakota and other tribes, the Sundance wasn't a quaint festival of songs and feathers. It was a brutal negotiation with the universe. Young men, ready to prove their devotion and courage, had skewers driven through the flesh of their chests or backs. Those skewers were tied with rawhide thongs to poles, or sometimes to heavy buffalo skulls. Then the dance began. Imagine it. Drums pounding, songs rising, the sun blazing overhead, and you half naked, sweat streaking down your body, leaning back against those rawhide cords. The pain sharpened as you pulled, harder and harder, skin stretching like rope under strain. The goal, tear-free, not metaphorically, literally rip the skewers out of your own flesh, leaving behind ragged holes as offerings to the Great Spirit. Your blood spattering the earth wasn't tragedy, it was devotion. Proof that you'd sacrificed part of yourself so that your people might live. And this wasn't done in private, behind closed doors. It was done in the center of camp, with the entire community watching. Elders prayed, women wept, children stared, wide-eyed. Every wince, every gasp, every final tearing snap of flesh was part of the ceremony. Your pain wasn't yours alone, it was shared, it was witnessed, it was transformed into collective meaning. In some variations, the ordeal lasted hours, even days. Dancers fasted, deprived of food and water, eyes fixed on the sun until visions came. Pain wasn't just endured, it was harnessed. The tearing of flesh was supposed to open the veil between worlds, to invite visions, guidance, spiritual renewal. Your suffering became a cosmic conversation, one scream at a time. It sounds barbaric to modern ears, but think about it. Every society has demanded proof of devotion. Some demand money, some demand time, some demand silent obedience. Here, the price was higher. Flesh was the currency, the pain was the receipt, and the scars. There were contracts written directly onto your body, never expiring, never erasable. Of course, this wasn't unique to the plains. Across the globe, offering pieces of flesh shows up again and again. In parts of Polynesia, early tattoo rituals combined cutting, pigment, and endurance into a single ordeal. In Africa, initiates sometimes sliced parts of their skin deliberately as offerings, leaving wounds rubbed with ash. Even in South Asia, devotees sometimes pierced tongues or cheeks, offering their bodies as vessels of prayer. You, let's be honest, you wouldn't last long tethered to a pole with hooks pulling at your chest. You'd yank once, scream, and beg for ibuprofen, and the community would shake their heads, whispering about your lack of vision, your weak will, your empty offering. Because here, endurance wasn't just about proving you were strong, it was about proving you were connected to the people, to the spirits, to the entire balance of the cosmos. And just when you think nothing could top the sight of men ripping their flesh open to the sound of drums, along comes another ritual, simpler, quieter, but no less brutal. One where adulthood isn't sealed with scars or hooks, but with beatings so merciless they leave your body swollen, bruised, and redefined. By now, you've been bled, burned, pierced, and tethered. And you might think, surely, children were spared this circus of agony. No. Because in many cultures, the fastest way to hammer childhood out of you was quite literally to hammer it out of you. Welcome to initiation by beatings, where the path to adulthood began with a good, old-fashioned thrashing. Take parts of East and Southern Africa. Among the Xhosa, for example, boys entering initiation camps weren't given gentle encouragement, but whippings, canings, and ritual tests of pain. It wasn't random cruelty, it was instruction. You were taught, through welts and bruises, that adulthood meant endurance, silence, and control. If you cried, you failed. If you flinched, you embarrassed your family. If you stood still, bleeding down your back, you became a man. And this wasn't just African logic. In Papua New Guinea, similar practices unfolded in men's houses, where boys were beaten as a way of purging childhood weakness. The pain wasn't hidden, it was choreographed. Adults hit with purpose, each strike a word in a language of transformation. You will obey, you will endure, you will belong. Think of the psychology here. Your very body became the chalkboard. Every bruise was a lesson, every welt a grade, and there were no easy A's. Children emerged battered, but also reborn, their pain witnessed by the community, their silence noted as proof they were no longer soft. In some societies, beatings accompanied circumcision or scarification, layering pain upon pain like a sadistic syllabus. You didn't just lose your foreskin or gain new scars, you received lashes to seal the ordeal. Suffering wasn't optional, it was mandatory coursework in the school of life. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The logic wasn't entirely alien. Even in cultures without initiation camps, we still hear echoes of discipline through pain. Corporal punishment is a way to toughen children, to prepare them for a harsh world. The difference? In initiation camps, the whole community showed up. Your bruises weren't a family secret, they were a public badge of endurance. Now imagine yourself at 12, stripped, surrounded by elders, the air thick with dust and expectation. Your hand did nothing but silence. The first strike lands, the second, the third, the blows don't stop, and the eyes watching you don't blink. Your test isn't about strength, it's about stillness, about swallowing pain without betraying it. One scream, and you've failed. One flinch, and you've marked yourself as weak. And when it's over, you don't get ice packs, hugs, or consolation. You get nods, approval, maybe even celebration. You've graduated through pain, not despite it. Childhood ended not with cake or candles, but with bruises as thick as your new responsibilities. But let's be honest, you'd cry at the first strike. Not because you're weak, but because we live in a world where pain has been outsourced to Tylenol and therapy. And yet, in these societies, bruises weren't cruelty, they were transformation. The lash was less about punishment than about sculpting you into someone who could withstand the weight of community life. And if you thought beatings were extreme, wait until you meet cultures where fire wasn't just touched or walked upon, it was pressed into your skin, branding you forever with the mark of belonging. You might think beatings were the final straw. That surely, after whipping and bruising children into adulthood, cultures would take a break. But no, in Polynesia, the test of devotion wasn't satisfied with raised welts or bloodied backs. They decided the gods wanted something hotter, sharper, more permanent. And so came the rituals of firewalking and branding, where you proved your soul by sacrificing your souls, and sometimes your skin itself. Imagine yourself in Fiji centuries ago. The fire pit is laid out, a trench of stones, heated for hours until they glow with the quiet menace of molten lava. The entire community gathers, eyes fixed on you. This isn't a casual dare around a barbecue, it's a religious demonstration. The gods of the land and ancestors are watching, and your job is to prove that their protection burns brighter than the stones beneath your feet. You step forward, the air thick with smoke and chanting. Barefoot, you walk, slowly, deliberately, not sprinting like a coward, but gliding with dignity. Each step sears, your skin blisters. But the community doesn't see burns, they see proof of divine favor. If you emerge limping, the gods clearly doubted you. If you emerge unscathed, or at least pretending you're untouchable. And here's the unsettling part. People often did walk across coals without obvious injury. Was it faith? Physics? The thin layer of ash insulating the heat? maybe all of the above. But in that moment, nobody cared about science. They cared that you put your flesh in the furnace and trusted the gods to keep you intact. But firewalking wasn't the only method. Some groups in Polynesia went further, branding initiates with hot stones or embers pressed directly onto the skin. Imagine the smell of your own flesh sizzling while elders nodded solemnly. This wasn't punishment. This was beautification, sanctification. A scar shaped like a circle or pattern wasn't shameful, it was sacred. Every mark said, "I have touched the fire, and the fire has touched me." It's worth noting how communal these rituals were. Just like scarification or beatings, this wasn't done in secret. Entire villages gathered to watch. The point wasn't just to prove something to yourself, it was to prove it publicly, in front of witnesses who'd never forget whether you walked steady or stumbled screaming. Reputation, after all, was carved by fire as much as flesh. And it wasn't limited to Polynesia. Across cultures, fire has always been the judge. In medieval Europe, trial by fire decided guilt or innocence. Walk across hot irons or hold them in your hands heal cleanly, and God had saved you. Scarred badly, and, well, you were guilty. End of story. Imagine the absurdity of a legal system where third-degree burns were considered reliable evidence. But again, it wasn't absurd to them. It was divine arbitration, the flame as God's fingerprint. Now, picture yourself at that edge of the pit. The stones crack, the heat slaps your face before you've even moved. You step forward. 1, 2, 3. Your skin sticks, your soles blister, your nerves scream. But you can't scream. You walk like nothing's wrong. You emerge, smoke rising from your feet, and the crowd roars. Not because you survived, but because you endured with grace. And if you think firewalking sounds bad, at least, it didn't take anything personal. Because the next ritual doesn't stop at scars or burns. It goes straight for the most intimate part of the body. Carving adulthood from your genitals in ceremonies that demanded silence while every nerve begged you to scream. So far, you've been whipped, burned, cut, scarred, and branded, and you might think there's nothing left to take. But there's always one final frontier, one sacred territory where tradition sharpened its blade, your genitals. Because across cultures, manhood and womanhood weren't official until a knife made the announcement. Circumcision, in its many forms, was and still is one of the most enduring rituals. In Jewish and Islamic traditions, it marks covenant and community. But in much of Africa, circumcision wasn't a quiet, quick ceremony with a sterile blade and an audience of 2 doctors. It was an ordeal. Among the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, for instance, boys underwent circumcision at adolescence, with no anesthetic, no soft music, no comforting hand to hold. The entire village watched. The rule was simple: don't flinch, don't cry, don't move. One grimace and you shamed not just yourself but your entire family. Silence was manhood, and this wasn't limited to boys. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, female genital cutting was and in some places still is a ritual of belonging. A practice framed as purification, as preparation for marriage, as the only way a girl could be considered whole. The methods varied, the pain was excruciating, and the scars were permanent. The cultural logic was the same. The body had to be altered, reshaped, controlled, to carry the weight of identity. Among some Aboriginal groups in Australia, boys endured circumcision, where the underside of the penis was slit open along the length of the urethra. Imagine adolescence beginning with that. The pain was catastrophic, the bleeding dangerous, but the act symbolized transformation. Your body literally split to mark your new status. In some societies, the procedure was repeated, widened over time, as if one cut wasn't quite enough. And yes, infections, hemorrhage, and even death were risks. But risk was part of the ritual. Survival meant the gods or the ancestors had approved. Failure meant you weren't meant to carry the title of adult. In cultures where childhood had to be killed off violently, gentleness was never the point. Picture yourself there. You're 12, maybe 14. You're surrounded by peers, elders, and family. The air is buzzing with expectation. A sharp blade flashes in the sunlight. You lie down, or perhaps you're held down. You know the rules. No sound, no flinch, no tears. Then the cut. Agony rips through you. But you keep your face still, eyes fixed on the horizon. Blood soaks the earth. Elders nod approvingly. You've crossed the threshold. You're no longer a child, you're scarred, silent, and, in their eyes, complete. And if you failed, if you cried out, if you moved, if the blade slipped and your nerves betrayed you, you carried that shame forever. Because here, the wound wasn't just physical, it was social, spiritual. It rewrote your status, your worth, your future. You, sitting comfortably now, probably wouldn't last a second. The thought alone makes you squirm. But in those communities, this was the centerpiece of becoming. Pain wasn't unfortunate. Pain was necessary. And if you thought the gods were finished after carving your most intimate parts, you're wrong. Because sometimes, the test wasn't about flesh at all, it was about poison. About swallowing death to prove you deserved to live. You've bled, you've burned, you've been cut in places you'd rather not mention, and you might think nothing could top that. But in some societies, survival wasn't measured by scars or screams. It was measured by swallowing poison and waiting to see whether you keeled over. Welcome to trial by ordeal, where the judge, jury, and executioner came in liquid form. Take West Africa. Among the crew and other groups in Liberia, there was the ordeal of sassywood, a drink brewed from the bark of the Calabar bean tree, accused of witchcraft. Forget cross-examination. You'd be handed a cup of this toxic brew, thick, bitter, and laced with alkaloids, capable of shutting down your nervous system. If you drank it and lived, congratulations, you were innocent. If you convulsed, vomited, and died, well, guess the gods confirmed you were guilty after all. Convenient, wasn't it? Justice by stomach acid. And the Calabar bean wasn't alone. In parts of Madagascar, there was the Tangina ordeal, where suspects were forced to consume poison from the Tangina nut. Survival proved purity. Death proved guilt. Entire communities gathered to watch, as if the stomach's reaction to toxins was somehow the most reliable moral compass available. Imagine your entire reputation, your entire life, hanging on whether your body could metabolize poison faster than your neighbors. This wasn't confined to Africa. In medieval Europe, ordeals by water or fire operated on the same logic. Accused of sorcery, you'd be tossed into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because obviously water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, but also drowned. Aquatic justice. Fire worked the same way. Carry a red-hot iron bar, walk 3 paces, then wait 3 days. If your wounds healed cleanly, God had exonerated you. If they festered, you were toast, literally and spiritually. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity, but remember, these trials weren't seen as random cruelty. They were divine arbitration. Humans couldn't know the truth, but the gods could. Poison, fire, water, these were instruments of higher judgment, sacred lie detectors. Survival wasn't luck, it was verdict. Now picture yourself in that position. The village gathers, elders mutter prayers. A steaming bowl of poison bark broth is placed in your hands. Everyone's watching, neighbors, rivals, maybe even family, hoping for your downfall. Your lips touch the liquid, it burns your tongue, your stomach knots. You fight the urge to gag as your throat closes. Your fate depends on holding it down, on not collapsing, on convincing the gods and your community that you're pure. Each second stretches into eternity. Your body trembles, eyes watch closely. Are you swaying too much? Are your lips turning blue? Survival isn't just biology, it's theater. And let's be honest, you wouldn't make it. Even if by miracle you survived the poison, the stress alone would kill you. The fear, the eyes, the pressure, it was as deadly as the brew itself. And yet, for those who did endure, the logic was unshakable. If the gods spared you, you were clean. If not, well, at least your death reassured the community that justice had been done. But if drinking poison sounds like the worst possible way to prove your worth, remember this: some cultures decided the ultimate proof wasn't in the stomach, but in the flames. Flames that consumed not just flesh, but entire lives, offered as firewood for the gods. If poison trials seemed cruel, at least you had a chance of walking away. Fire, on the other hand, didn't deal in probabilities. In some traditions, it consumed everything. It wasn't enough to bleed, to scar, to drink bitter toxins. No, you had to burn, because fire wasn't just flame. It was purity, devotion, and sometimes, the only way to prove loyalty beyond doubt. Take sati in South Asia. For centuries, widows in parts of India were expected or pressured to join their husbands on the funeral pyre. Imagine this: your husband dies, the body laid out on wood, flames crackling. You'll lead forward, draped in ritual cloth, surrounded by priests chanting and neighbors nodding solemnly. Then you lie down beside him as the fire is lit. The logic was brutal. If you truly loved him, you wouldn't hesitate. You'd burn together, devotion proven in smoke. Refuse, and your loyalty, your purity, your very worth as a wife, was questioned. Romance, it turns out, could be fatal. Not all fire rituals were about forced loyalty. Some were about chosen sacrifice. In Buddhist traditions, self-immolation became the ultimate act of offering. The most famous case, Thich Quang Gysi, a Vietnamese monk who, in 1963, sat calmly in a lotus position in the middle of Saigon traffic, poured gasoline over himself, and lit a match. Eyewitnesses watched as he burned alive without moving, without screaming, while others gasped and fainted. It wasn't an accident. It was a protest, a prayer, a public declaration that spirit could endure where flesh could not. For Buddhists who practiced it, burning wasn't destruction, it was transcendence. And if you think that's modern drama, remember the Aztecs. In their rituals, victims were sometimes burned alive as offerings to deities like Xuchitl, the god of fire. Others were burned partially, then pulled from the flames and sacrificed by hand, because why settle for one form of death when you can combine two? For the Aztecs, fire wasn't just an element, it was a mouth, hungry and divine, devouring human bodies to keep cosmic order intact. Imagine yourself there, the firewood stacked, the crowd humming with expectation. The heat licks your skin before the flames even reach you. Your instincts scream to run, but you don't. Because to flee is shame, dishonor, abandonment. To stay, to let the flames swallow you, is proof. Proof of love, proof of faith, proof that your life wasn't yours, it was theirs. And here's the strange thing. Fire rituals weren't remembered as cruelty. They were remembered as triumph. Communities told stories of widows smiling as the flames rose, of monks sitting unmoved as their skin blackened, of victims becoming one with gods through smoke. Horror to us, holiness to them. Let's be honest, you wouldn't make it past the first spark. The heat alone would send you scrambling for the nearest river. But for those who stayed, who burned, the fire wrote their devotion into memory, sometimes into legend. And if you thought fire left the most permanent mark, wait until you see what came next. Some cultures didn't burn you, didn't beat you, didn't poison you. They carved their devotion directly into your skin with bone tools and ink, turning your body into a living manuscript of pain. You might think fire was the ultimate finale, ashes to ashes, devotion proven in smoke. But in some cultures, fire was too temporary. They wanted proof that lingered, that walked with you, that could be read like scripture centuries later. So they reached for bone needles, soot, and patience, and invented tattooing. Not the painless hum of an electric gun in an air-conditioned parlor, but a bloody ordeal where every mark was hammered into you with tools that looked better suited for carpentry. Take Polynesia. Their tattooing wasn't fashion, it was theology. In Samoa, the pea was the full-body tattoo given to men, stretching from waist to knees. It was a brutal marathon of pain. The tools were bone combs dipped in ink, tapped into the skin with a mallet. Not once, not twice, thousands of taps, each one forcing pigment deep into open wounds. The process could last months, even years, done in sessions so excruciating that some initiates fainted, vomited, or begged for mercy. Infection was common. Death wasn't unheard of. But if you survived, your body was transformed into a walking text of identity, courage, and devotion. Borneo had its own tradition. Tattoos, they weren't decorative, they were spiritual maps. Patterns inked into the skin protected warriors in battle, guided the dead in the afterlife, or marked women as skilled weavers and caretakers. Each line carried meaning, each dot a prayer. The pain of the process wasn't incidental, it was essential. Because in these traditions, beauty had to be earned. And let's not forget the Maori in New Zealand, whose moko wasn't ink on skin, but chiseling into flesh. Imagine your face carved with sharp tools, grooves filled with pigment, swelling into permanent furrows of identity. These weren't tattoos you could laser off later, they were scars, ridges, the story of your lineage literally sculpted into your skull. A Maori face wasn't just a face, it was a genealogy, a declaration, a history lesson told in blood and bone. Now picture yourself lying there, skin stretched, bone comb tapping, ink dripping into raw cuts. The sound is rhythmic, relentless tap, 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 like rain on a roof. But this isn't rain. It's the slow chiseling of your willpower. Each sting compounds the last, nerves screaming, sweat soaking your body. You clench your teeth, you hold still, because to move is shame, to endure is honor. And here's the truth. Tattoos in these cultures weren't optional accessories. They were mandatory passports into adulthood, into marriage, into spiritual legitimacy. A body without them wasn't just plain, it was empty, incomplete, suspect. You weren't really part of the community until the marks said you were. Compare that to modern ink culture, where people agonize for days over whether to get a butterfly on their ankle. Back then, you didn't get a choice of design. Your culture wrote the script, your body was the paper, and the pain was the ink. Would you survive it? Doubtful. One look at the sharpened bone comb, one strike of the mallet, and you'd be scrambling for excuses about why unmarked skin is perfectly fine. But in those societies, there was no opt-out clause. You either endured the tap-tap until your body was covered, or you lived forever as an outsider. And yet, as permanent as those tattoos were, there was one ordeal even more final. Because some rituals weren't about surviving pain at all. They were about not surviving. Death itself could be the offering, the transformation, the final initiation. Every cut, every scar, every burn, every welt was preparation for the ultimate ritual, giving not just parts of your body, but the whole thing. Because in some cultures, the final proof of devotion wasn't survival, it was death. You didn't just join adulthood, you joined the gods, permanently. Take the Aztecs. They believed the sun rose and set only because humans fed it with blood. And not just dribbles from tongues or ears, but whole human lives. Captives were led up temple steps, laid across stone altars, and had their hearts cut out by obsidian blades, still sharper than surgical steel. The heart, still beating, was raised skyward to feed the gods. The body, discarded, sometimes rolled down the temple stairs in front of the crowd. Thousands could be sacrificed in a single festival. A choreography of death, so vast it still stuns historians. Imagine being one of those victims, watching the sky shrink above you as priests pinned your arms. For the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty. It was cosmic maintenance. For you, it was the worst group project imaginable. The Incas had their own approach. The Capecoca ritual chose children, yes, children of exceptional beauty or nobility, considered pure enough to be offered on mountaintops. They were dressed in fine clothes, given food and chicha beer, and then led up the Andes, where thin air and cold awaited. Buried alive or left to freeze in tombs carved into peaks, they became eternal emissaries to the gods. Archaeologists have found their bodies centuries later, mummified by ice, faces serene, as if sleep had been their final transformation. But don't be fooled, serenity was constructed. Death at 12 wasn't peaceful. It was demanded. Even Norse sagas hinted at rituals of death. The infamous Blood Eagle execution, though debated, was described as a ritual offering to Odin, where ribs were hacked open and lungs pulled out to resemble wings. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the idea reveals something important. Death could be sculpted into performance, a spectacle that bound myth and flesh, and death wasn't always forced. In some cases, victims volunteered. For the Aztecs, certain captives chosen for sacrifice were treated like gods for a year, fed, clothed, adored before being killed in ritual. Imagine living as a deity only to realize your contract came with an expiration date. For some, the honor outweighed the horror. For others, well, let's just say they probably didn't get much say in the matter. Picture yourself in any of these scenarios. You're not the spectator this time, you're the offering. You're led by priests, dressed in ritual clothes, perfumed, praised, drums pound, incense smokes. The air feels heavy with inevitability. You kneel, or lie down, or walk up the mountain path. Your chest tightens not just with fear, but with the weight of expectation. Around you, the crowd isn't mourning. They're nodding, approving, whispering prayers. To them, your death isn't tragedy. It's necessity. And here's the final irony. For all the brutality, the victims weren't erased from memory. They were elevated. Children on mountaintops became intermediaries. Warriors on altars became fuel for the sun. Death was the end of life, yes, but also the continuation of community, cosmos, balance. You, though you'd have bolted long before the first drumbeat, you'd be hiding in the crowd, insisting you were really more of a supporter of ritual than a participant. And yet, In these worlds, you wouldn't have had that choice. The knife, the fire, the mountain, they would have claimed you. Because in the end, brutal rituals weren't about sadism. They were about transformation, belonging, transcendence. You were remade not by surviving them, but by enduring them, if it killed you. Especially if it killed you. Across the scattered corners of human history, the transition from boy to man rarely came with sweetness. It came, more often than not, with blood. Pain, in these societies, wasn't just tolerated, it was curated, polished, and elevated into a sort of social currency. The logic was simple, if not entirely kind. Only someone who had endured real agony could be trusted with power, with women, with weapons. And so entire cultures crafted their sons like blacksmiths at the forge, striking them again and again until the body bore proof of resilience. Among the Maasai of East Africa, circumcision without flinching marked a boy as a man. One grimace, one tremor of the eyelid, and he carried shame heavier than the wound itself. In Aboriginal Australia, front teeth were knocked out with sharp stones, blood running freely while older men sang over the scene. In Papua New Guinea, the Sambia had boys swallow bitter cane and endure nosebleeds induced by sharp sticks, purging childhood and filling them with the supposed essence of warriors. To modern sensibilities, it sounds like cruelty. To them, it was architecture. Society had to be built on bodies willing to endure. The connection between suffering and adulthood is older than writing, older than cities. Across continents, pain was treated as the universal grammar of masculinity. Where literacy failed, scars spoke fluently. A boy's ability to withstand injury became less about his personal threshold, and more about the group's assurance that he could be trusted when life inevitably turned difficult, bloody, and short. The reasoning was brutal but oddly practical. A warrior who could not bear a knife across the chest during ritual probably wouldn't last long when facing one in battle. And so these ceremonies became less about the wound itself, and more about what the wound performed, strength, not for the self, but for the collective. The scar on the skin was a permanent document, a body turned into public property, marked and read like a book by every eye that glanced over it. Boys entered screaming, but emerged rewritten. From here, the path naturally twists toward the specific tools societies used to leave their indelible mark. Pain was not abstract. It was art, executed with method, precision, and imagination. And nowhere was this artistry more visible than in the patterns cut and burned into young flesh, transforming skin into a lifelong emblem of passage. Skin, after all, was the most obvious canvas. If a boy was to be remade, his body had to display it, stitched into him like a text nobody could erase. Scarification was one of the oldest and most persistent methods. Lines, carved, flesh raised, entire histories written in scars that would catch the sun for the rest of his life. In parts of West Africa, boys were pinned down while sharpened blades cut deep geometric patterns into their torsos, shoulders, or faces. The cuts were deliberate, not random. Each line stood for clan, rank, or stage of maturity. Infection was almost guaranteed, but that was part of the trial. The raised scars that eventually formed weren't accidental disfigurement. They were the proof of endurance. The body's way of declaring, I lived through this, I belong to them. Branding, too, carried its own dark poetry. Among some groups, glowing embers or heated iron rods pressed into skin left permanent sigils of belonging. The pain was instant and unbearable, but it was quick, decisive. One scream, one hiss of searing flesh, and the boy stepped forever outside the sphere of childhood. Anthropologists have often noted that these scars worked less as decoration and more as passports. In villages where everyone bore the same designs, one unscarred body looked suspiciously incomplete, untrustworthy, even less than human. It wasn't beauty they were after, it was legibility. The body was turned into a document you couldn't forge or fake, a lifelong reminder to the bearer and to anyone else who cared to glance. And the irony, of course, is that scars, signs of wounding, became symbols of wholeness. To be smooth-skinned was to be unfinished, half-formed, a child masquerading in a man's frame. But if scars etched into the flesh made manhood visible, they were not the only ordeal. Some cultures didn't just ask for permanent marks, they demanded that boys prove their endurance in real time. Before the eyes of their community, where failing wasn't just private humiliation, but public collapse. The stage was set not for artistry, but for sheer endurance. If scars made manhood visible, then endurance made it audible. The silence of a boy under pain was as loud as any drum. In many cultures, the trial was less about what was cut into the flesh, and more about whether one could stand, still and unflinching, while agony rained down. Among the Spartans, boys were whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, beaten until their skins split and blood covered the stones. The spectacle wasn't hidden in some private corner, it was ritual theater. Families, priests, fellow citizens all watched to see if a boy could keep his face still, his lips closed, his pride intact. To flinch was to betray not only oneself but the city. There are reports of boys collapsing, even dying under the lash, but that only made the survivors more valued. Pain was currency, and death the inflation nobody dared mention. Half a world away, the pattern repeated. Among certain Amazonian groups, boys were forced to wear gloves woven with angry bullet ants. Their stings delivering a level of pain anthropologists routinely rank among the worst imaginable. The boy had to endure the fire running through his nervous system, standing still for hours while his body screamed. It wasn't about fighting, it was about standing motionless, proof that willpower could dominate even venom. And if he cried out, then the manhood he was meant to claim slipped away in laughter and shame. What's striking is how public these ordeals always were. A private trial could be survived with excuses. A public one erased the possibility of lying. The community watched not to enjoy the suffering, though it's hard not to think some did, but to bind the boy's agony into collective memory. His pain belonged to all of them, a shared reference point that ensured he would never forget who had witnessed his silence. Endurance, then, was not only about surviving pain, but about surviving an audience. And when the ordeal ended, boys often found themselves ripped away from the familiar embrace of mothers, sisters, and the safety of home. To be remade into men, they had to first learn to live without softness, cut off from warmth and thrust into the territory of fear. After the cuts and the blows, the next cruelty wasn't physical but spatial, separation, almost everywhere. Becoming a man meant being taken from the women who raised you and dropped into some darker corner of the world. The separation could last weeks, months, even years, depending on the culture. But the logic was chillingly consistent. Boys had to be pried out of the warmth of childhood and planted in the barren soil of solitude. In Papua New Guinea, some groups locked boys into men's houses, huts heavy with the smell of smoke and secrecy. Mothers wept outside while the boys inside were taught that their old lives were over. Childhood wasn't just ended, it was buried. In parts of southern Africa, initiates were marched into the bush and abandoned there, expected to survive with only one another, away from food, comfort, or protection. What happened in those forests, the hunger, the fear, the whispered teachings of older Menuas, never spoken of again in public. Silence was as much part of the ritual as pain. The fear wasn't accidental, it was engineered. A boy alone at night, hearing predators cry or spirits imagined in the dark, was forced into confrontation, not with an enemy, but with the raw terror of his own mind. The absence of women wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. To sever the maternal bond was to cut away softness, to dry up tears, to force the boy into a new allegiance, the brotherhood of men who had endured the same ordeal. Anthropologists often describe this stage as a kind of death rehearsal. Boys left the village as children, but were declared, in a symbolic sense, dead. When they finally returned, scarred and starved, they were reborn with new names, new roles, and new rules to follow. And perhaps nothing illustrates that rebirth more dramatically than what came next: rituals that targeted not just the skin, but the most vulnerable part of the body, where life itself is carried. If fear carved the soul, the knife now carved the body where it was most tender. Few practices so clearly marked the line between boyhood and manhood as circumcision and its even harsher cousins. Across continents, the genitals became the stage for proving courage, a cruel logic, perhaps, but one that societies treated with utter seriousness. Among the Xhosa of South Africa, boys were circumcised in groups, without anesthesia, by elders armed with a blade and the authority of tradition. The ritual wasn't hidden away, it was a performance of silence. To flinch, to cry out, to move even slightly was unthinkable. The wound was then covered with clay or ash, and the boys were left to heal in seclusion, infection and fever stalking them like spirits. Those who survived carried their scar as both pride and passport. Those who didn't became cautionary tales, reminders that not every boy makes it through the furnace. Australia's Aboriginal peoples often took the ordeal even further. Some groups practiced circumcision, splitting the underside of the penis with a sharp flake of stone so that urine and semen would flow differently ever after. To outside eyes, it seems unspeakable. To them, it was a sacred reshaping of the body, a way of aligning a man's flesh with the cosmological order. The blood spilled wasn't just penance, was an offering, the body's tribute to forces greater than itself. The logic behind such violence was almost mathematical. If a boy could endure mutilation at the seat of life, he was surely capable of bearing every other hardship that manhood demanded. Fertility, sexuality, and strength were all tangled into the same wound, and when the blood dried, the boy was no longer merely himself. He was part of a lineage, marked in the same way as his father, his grandfather, and every man before him. But scars on the genitals weren't the only disfigurements demanded by initiation. In other corners of the world, the face itself became the site of transformation. Teeth knocked out, smiles forever altered, pain locked into every word spoken afterward. If the genitals carried the weight of private pain, the mouth carried the public one. Teeth, after all, are the first thing people see when someone speaks or smiles. Removing them violently, without drugs, without mercy, turned every conversation into a reminder of passage. Among Aboriginal Australians, front teeth were struck out with stones or wooden mallets during initiation. The boy was forced to sit still while older men pried or shattered the incisors, the roots snapping deep in the jaw. Blood poured freely, infection lingered, and the empty gap became a permanent mark of belonging. No child could fake it, no outsider could wear it. The absence was its own kind of presence. In parts of East Africa, tooth avulsion carried another layer of utility. During famines or epidemics, when the jaw clenched shut in sickness, those missing teeth allowed food or medicine to be dripped directly into the body. What looked like pure cruelty had a survival logic hidden inside. But for initiates, it was less about medicine and more about endurance. The message was clear. Your very face is no longer yours. It's been claimed, altered, and placed in the service of your people. And it didn't stop with teeth. Some societies pierced noses or stretched earlobes during initiation, reshaping the body into a visible archive of pain. Others demanded cuts along the tongue or chest, wounds that left thick ridges or raised welts like maps across the skin. A boy's body was no longer just flesh, it was history, geography, law. Every glance at those marks reminded him where he came from and what he owed. Yet, while scars and missing teeth displayed permanence, other rituals dug deeper into the body's fluids themselves. Blood let loose deliberately, poisons ingested on purpose, suffering forced inside as much as it was etched outside. Pain carved into the skin was one thing, but some societies seemed determined to make boys bleed from the inside out. Bloodletting became a ritual vocabulary, a way of showing that the body could be drained and still endure, that life could spill yet not be lost. In Papua New Guinea, the Sambia forced boys to insert sharpened reeds into their nostrils until blood poured freely down their chests. The logic, if grimly poetic, was that childhood contamination had to be purged, flushed out like spoiled water from a jar. Each gush of red was both cleansing and proof. To gag, to resist, to hesitate meant more punishment, while those who bled freely were said to emerge lighter, emptied of boyhood. Elsewhere, tongues were pierced, veins nicked, or wounds reopened so blood could be offered to ancestors. The Aztecs made young warriors draw their own blood with stingray spines, or maguey thorns, an ordeal that blurred the line between devotion and torture. To give blood was not optional. It was obligation, the body's tax to the gods and the community. And then came the poison, sometimes drunk, sometimes smoked, sometimes rubbed directly into fresh cuts. In the Amazon, initiates swallowed infusions of bitter plants that induced violent vomiting, convulsions, or hallucinations. The suffering wasn't the side effect, it was the point. Purging through poison was a rehearsal for adult life, where hunger, sickness, and war were constant companions. Surviving the poison meant you might just survive the world. There was an elegance to this logic, however harsh. The body wasn't simply marked or beaten. It was cleansed, altered, remade from the inside. A boy didn't just endure wounds, he had to endure his own fluids betraying him, rushing out or twisting against him. And when blood and bile had done their work, another element waited with equal cruelty: heat, fire, smoke, burning embers, the rituals that turned boys into men through flame. When blood had been drained and poisons endured, many societies turned to fire, the most ancient tool and the most unforgiving. Heat became the final arbiter, a way of proving that a boy could stand where others would shrink back, that he could step into the very element that cooked food, forged weapons, and destroyed villages. In Polynesia, young men were sometimes made to walk barefoot across beds of glowing stones, the heat searing into souls while elders sang or chanted. To stumble, to run, to scream, these were failures worse than burns. The ritual wasn't about escape, it was about composure. Blisters healed, but shame lingered longer than scars. Other initiations used fire less theatrically, but more cruelly. In parts of Africa, smoldering sticks were pressed against skin, leaving round brands that blistered and blackened before turning into permanent marks. Sometimes the brands were placed deliberately over old scars, layering pain upon pain as if to insist that endurance had to be rehearsed more than once. Even the environment could be turned into an oven. In South America, some tribes enclosed boys inside smoke-filled huts, choking them with heat and ash while they were forced to remain silent. Emerging alive meant strength. Collapsing in tears meant ridicule. The suffocating air was a lesson in patience, endurance, and the strange intimacy between pain and rebirth. Fire carried a cruel symmetry. It could kill, but it could also harden. Just as iron was tempered in flame, so too was the body. After all, what was a man, in the eyes of his people, if he couldn't stand the same element that shaped the spear he was expected to carry? And yet, once burned and branded, boys often had one more ordeal ahead, facing each other. Pain shared alone was proof enough, but pain shared through combat sealed brotherhood in blood. After the knife, the poison, and the fire, many societies required one last test, to stand against one's own peers. Ritual combat was less about victory than it was about stamina, less about domination than about showing that pain delivered by another's hand could be carried without collapse. Among the Yanomami of the Amazon, boys traded chest blows in a grim exchange of fists, each strike greeted not with retaliation but with stoic stillness. The goal wasn't to win, it was to withstand. Bruises spread across ribcages like dark metals, and swelling was paraded as a badge of endurance. To drop one's arm or stagger back meant a loss that lingered far beyond the bruises. The Nuer of South Sudan turned to stick-slong, heavy rods swung in brutal arcs at each other's heads and shoulders. Matches left initiates bloodied and concussed, yet quitting was unthinkable. Blood spilled here wasn't a tragedy, it was an ingredient, proof that boys could pour some of themselves onto the earth and still rise again. And then there was blood not shared in violence, but shared deliberately. In parts of Melanesia, ritual bloodletting between boys symbolized a literal bond, cut palms pressed together, wounds mingling so that brotherhood wasn't metaphor but physiology. The idea was stark. One didn't just endure with others, one became others. Manhood wasn't individual achievement, but collective fusion, sealed in scars and bruises. It was here, in these orchestrated beatings and blood pacts, that the final transformation took shape. Pain wasn't endured alone anymore. It was synchronized, choreographed, shared until it wove a net no boy could escape. And by the end, when skin bore scars, faces carried gaps where teeth had been, and bodies knew every flavor of agony, a boy no longer looked like what he had been. He emerged rewritten, claimed by his people, declared dead to childhood and alive to duty. What followed was never tender, but it was final. The moment societies declared the ordeal complete, and pain, at last, became the proof of rebirth. When it was over, if it ever truly was, what remained wasn't just scars, burns, or missing teeth. What remained was a body that no longer belonged to itself. The boy had been disassembled piece by piece, emptied of softness, and then rebuilt into something his community could recognize, trust, and control. Pain wasn't incidental. It was the raw material of transformation. In many African societies, returning from seclusion after circumcision or scarification was treated as a literal rebirth. Mothers wailed as if their sons had died, and in a way, they had. The children who once clung to their skirts were gone, replaced by silent figures wrapped in new clothing, speaking new words, sometimes even bearing new names. Death and resurrection without burial or grave, a human body recycled through agony. Anthropologists often point out that these initiations didn't only forge warriors, they forged memory. Every scar was a reminder that manhood had been earned at great cost. Every shared ordeal bound the cohort together, making sure no one could forget the night the hut filled with smoke, or the sting of ants in the gloves, or the hot iron pressed to skin. Pain became archive, and the body, its permanent library. The cruelty, if one can call it that, wasn't without a certain symmetry. Life for men in these societies was often short, brutal, and soaked in danger. To send a boy into adulthood without first proving he could endure was, to their minds, leaving him unprepared, like sending an unsharpened blade into battle. What looks like cruelty from afar was, up close, an attempt at survival training, however costly. And so, in culture after culture, from Africa to Oceania to the frozen edges of Siberia, the same pattern emerges. Boys were not allowed to drift naturally into manhood. They had to be forced, burned, beaten, bled, and branded into it. The result wasn't just a man, but a man marked, written over by society's demands, carrying the unmistakable signature of pain. The strange thing about giving away a body is that, in most places, it wasn't seen as strange at all. Flesh was treated like a negotiable instrument, skin and blood, the kind of currency the gods actually accepted. Unlike gold, which had the bad habit of being useful only to kings. Across the old temples of Mesopotamia, scraps of hair and fingernails were sealed in clay jars, tidy little installments of loyalty. Among the Maya, a drop of blood pressed from the tongue or ear was considered a kind of rent paid to the divine landlord, just enough to keep the sun rising on schedule. The principle was simple: no gift more valuable than the one you couldn't grow back. Anthropologists like to call this a reciprocal economy, which is a fancy way of saying people believed the universe ran on favors. Feed the gods, and maybe they wouldn't let your crops wither. Bleed for them, and maybe the rains would come back on time. The Aztec world sharpened this logic into something almost bureaucratic. Entire calendars carved in stone to schedule human deposits. Each chest split open with an obsidian knife, a direct debit in the ledger of cosmic order. It sounds grotesque, but for them it was perfectly practical. Without sacrifice, the sun would stall, the stars would fall, and the world would collapse back into the unlit chaos before creation. Of course, one might ask why anyone agreed to this arrangement. The answer, tucked inside myths and myths disguised as instructions, is that gods were greedy but also a little fragile. They needed nourishment. The human body was both tribute and fuel. In India, certain Vedic rituals described offerings of breath itself, life force, exhaled toward the fire altar, treated as the most refined portion of the self. Elsewhere, in Polynesian traditions, captives became gifts not merely of conquest but of sustenance, their bodies serving to seal alliances with gods who, inconveniently, seemed to think in terms of appetite. And so people accepted the logic: you give a little piece of yourself, or sometimes all of it, and the machinery of the cosmos keeps humming. It was, in its way, reassuring. A gruesome insurance policy, yes, but insurance nonetheless. And once you've put your body on the table as an acceptable form of currency, it's only a short step to treating pain itself as a kind of language, a way of proving to the gods that your devotion isn't counterfeit, that your prayers aren't empty words carved into air but etched directly into skin. Pain always had the unsettling advantage of being impossible to fake. Words could be chanted, promises made, but only the sting of a thorn pressed into the flesh, or a blade dragged across the skin, proved you meant it. In Mesoamerica, nobles dragged spiny ropes through their tongues and smeared the blood across bark paper, offering the gods a script written in agony. In the deserts of North America, young men fasted until their ribs stuck out, hanging from poles with hooks in their flesh, waiting for visions that only pain seemed capable of delivering. Pain wasn't merely endured, it was broadcast, a message written directly on the body's surface, visible to gods and neighbors alike. The act was persuasive precisely because it was costly. An ear cut, a scar that lingered, A tooth knocked loose, all spoke in a language no priest needed to translate. In some cases, it wasn't death that proved loyalty, but endurance. The endurance of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion was its own theology. Among the Maya, self-bloodletting by rulers wasn't just piety but performance. The crowd watched as the king sliced his own skin, their faith renewed not by sermons but by the sight of his pain. If he was willing to bleed, then surely the gods would be satisfied. And it was never just about the suffering itself, it was about its choreography. Whips striking in rhythm, knives cutting in ritual order, scars carved into symmetrical patterns, pain turned into art, pain rehearsed until it looked almost sacred. Christian flagellants in medieval Europe, parading with blood streaming down their backs, weren't so far from the vision seekers of the plains, or the ascetics in Hindu temples piercing their tongues with spears. Different gods, same method. Prove your faith by demonstrating that your body is expendable. But pain had another function. To it silenced doubt. The moment agony took over, the believer entered a state where the divine seemed more present, less negotiable. That sense of presence, whether one called it a vision, a trance, or simply relief from the unbearable, was the proof people needed that their loyalty had been registered. Pain, in other words, wasn't just evidence offered to the gods, it was evidence offered back to oneself. And once the body is accepted as both proof and offering, it becomes harder not to see it as a mirror of something greater, something cosmic, where each drop of blood or strip of flesh is more than just a piece of meat, it's a fragment of the universe itself. Ancient thought carried a peculiar conviction that the human body was not just a sack of bones and fluids, but a miniature model of the cosmos itself. Each part echoed something larger: veins like rivers, breath like wind, bones like mountains, blood like the rising sun itself. To give away a piece of that body wasn't simply mutilation. It was a way of tinkering with the very machinery of the universe. The Vedic tradition in India described sacrifice as a reenactment of creation. The cosmic being, Purusha, dismembered at the dawn of time, his mouth becoming priests, his arms warriors, his feet servants. Later worshippers mirrored this myth in miniature. A lock of hair tossed into a fire wasn't just hair, it was the smoke of the heavens. Fingernail clippings buried in temple ground became seeds of cosmic renewal. What looks to us like odd superstition was, to them, a carefully balanced system of correspondences. The body contained the world, and by offering pieces of it, one fed the world back into itself. Mesoamerican bloodletting followed the same reasoning. The king's blood wasn't just his own, it was the lifeblood of his city, his people, his land. A drop on paper, burned into smoke, returned the sun to its path. Even the Chinese, with their meticulous concern for the harmony of yin and yang, spoke of qi flowing in the body as though it were the same current that ran through heavens and earth. To puncture the skin, to release a little blood or breath, was to adjust the balance of the cosmos, like nudging a celestial wheel with the tiniest of levers. This sense of microcosm made the body endlessly useful. If drought struck, one might slice open flesh to water the soil with blood. If pestilence threatened, the infected could be offered to cleanse the rest. Their bodies seen as vessels carrying away chaos. The body was both laboratory and offering plate, simultaneously the cause of disorder and the key to restoring harmony. And of course, once rulers realized their own bodies stood in for the whole kingdom, the logic of power slipped neatly into this framework. A king who refused to bleed was a king who refused to keep the cosmos intact. Which brings us into the unsettling bargain of sacred power itself, where authority wasn't a crown or a throne, but the willingness to suffer as a contract with the divine. Kingship was never just about sitting on a throne and looking impressive in gold. It was a contract, inked not with signatures but with blood. In societies from the Nile to the Valley of Mexico, the ruler's body wasn't his own, it was collateral. The king bled so the fields would grow. He fasted so the rains would come. And if things went badly enough, he might even be killed to reset the balance. Power was less privilege than liability, a kind of cosmic insurance policy with catastrophic deductibles. Take the Maya, their kings slit tongues and genitals, drawing ropes studded with obsidian through the wounds, letting the blood drip onto bark paper, which was then burned. The smoke rose, carrying their essence into the other world. Crowds watched, reassured that the king had literally paid his dues. In Assyria, rulers stood as guarantors for the land omens of famine or eclipse. were often interpreted as signals that the king's flesh had somehow fallen out of alignment with cosmic order. Priests whispered that bloodletting or ritual suffering could correct it. Authority wasn't abstract, it was anatomical. Even in medieval Europe, kings were thought to embody the health of the realm. A king with a festering wound or wasting illness could spell disaster for crops and armies. The king's touch, supposedly curing diseases like scrofula, was the flip side of this belief. The ruler's body had potency that radiated outward, healing or harming. And in some African kingdoms, the idea was pushed to its grim extreme. If the ruler became weak or sickly, he could be ritually strangled or sacrificed, replaced before his failing body dragged the cosmos into ruin. Power, in this sense, was less about issuing commands than about being perpetually edible to the gods. The crown was a reminder not of safety, but of vulnerability. The higher the station, the more of your flesh was claimed. No king could sit comfortably, because the contract was renewed not with speeches or decrees, but with cuts, burns, and bruises that bound his authority to divine order. And once rulers accepted this principle that to rule meant to offer up their bodies, it was only a short, chilling step toward the belief that total surrender of the body might not just serve the gods, but actually transform a mortal into something divine. There has always been a peculiar conviction that the quickest route to godhood runs straight through the destruction of the body. Not by accident, not by sickness, but by design. Among Buddhist monks in Vietnam, the self-immolations of the 20th century were framed as acts of clarity. Not despair, the body turned to flame as an offering of absolute stillness, the flesh evaporating into smoke that was read as proof of transcendence. In older Hindu traditions, ascetics sat motionless through fire rituals, testing whether body and soul could be pried apart, the latter purified in the act of surrender. In Mesoamerica, the same principle wore a bloodier mask. Some individuals became except living embodiments of gods. For a season they were worshipped, fed, dressed in divine regalia. And then, at the appointed hour, they were sacrificed, their death completing the transformation from mortal representative to divine being, their essence thought to fuse with the god forever. The body wasn't merely destroyed, it was upgraded, made into the channel through which the human could dissolve into the eternal. The logic spread far beyond altars and flames. Christian saints wore chains beneath their robes, flayed themselves with whips, starved until their bodies looked like skeletal icons. The idea wasn't punishment for its own sake, but purification. By grinding down the vessel, one polished the soul until it reflected heaven. Tralanga Swami, the 19th century yogi of Varanasi, was said to sit naked for days, eating almost nothing, drinking only the Ganges itself. His body was treated as a porous thing, already more divine than human, and his refusal to preserve it became a testament that divinity had already begun its takeover. Becoming divine through sacrifice always carried an element of theater. The public needed to see it. The body collapsing into ash, the blood spilling onto temple steps, the saint's emaciated form glowing with a kind of unsettling peace. These were spectacles meant to convince everyone that the boundary between mortal and God could, under the right conditions, be crossed. And once people accepted that the body could serve as a bridge into divinity, they began to see that smaller acts, cutting, burning, fasting, enduring, could do more than elevate an individual. They could transform a child into an adult, a novice into a priest, the uninitiated into the sacred. Adolescence has never been allowed to slide by quietly. In most societies, it was not enough to simply grow taller, sprout hair, or stumble through the awkward transitions of youth. To become an adult required spectacle, and the ticket to entry was almost always pain. The body had to be offered, reshaped, or broken so that the gods and the community could stamp their approval. In parts of pre-colonial Africa, boys submitted to scarification, long lines of cuts pressed into their skin until their torsos became living maps. Each scar marked not only endurance but a social truth. Here was someone who had survived the god's test. Among the Sambia of Papua New Guinea, the passage into manhood demanded ritualized suffering that stripped away childhood, quite literally, through acts of bloodletting and enforced ordeals. Without it, the boy remained socially unfinished, a body without meaning. Other rites drew the drama out for months. Among the Mandan on the northern plains, youths were suspended from wooden poles by thongs skewered through the chest, eyes fixed on the sun as they waited for visions. In these ordeals, pain wasn't punishment, but initiation. The body, reshaped by torment, became a threshold. The boy who walked in was not the one who staggered out. Communities looked at the wounds, the hollowed cheeks, the raw silence of exhaustion, and declared, "Now you are one of us." Even hair and teeth could be conscripted into this transformation. Among certain indigenous groups in North America, teeth were knocked out as a sign of entering adulthood. In the Pacific Islands, tattoos etched into tender skin announced readiness for marriage or war. Each cut, each mark, each offering of flesh was less about cruelty than about proof. A new identity had been carved out of the body's surface. These rites remind us that offering the body wasn't always about feeding gods directly. Sometimes it was about reshaping a human until the divine, or at least the socially acceptable version of the divine order, could recognize them. And yet, once the body had been successfully used as a passport to adulthood, another logic emerged. If surrendering flesh could transform a boy into a man, why couldn't surrendering life itself immortalize a believer, turning them into something remembered long after the body had gone? Martyrdom has always thrived on the paradox that death can be the loudest form of speech. The body, silenced forever, somehow becomes eternal in memory. In early Christianity, martyrs were not mourned so much as celebrated. Their flesh, burned in Roman arenas or torn by beasts, was thought to glow with a strange dignity, each scream echoing into the next century as proof of unshakable faith. Bones and ashes were collected like treasure, distributed across the empire. Embedded beneath altars, fragments of mortal bodies, now functioning as divine relics. But the logic was hardly confined to one religion. In Japan, the practice of sakushinbutsu saw monks starving themselves over years, reducing their bodies to living corpses, slowly embalming from within. When they finally died, entombed upright in meditation, their remains were honored as proof that they had achieved Buddhahood. The body itself, usually dismissed as impermanent, became the very evidence of transcendence. In Islam, the memory of Hussein's death at Karbala turned his blood into a fountain of eternal mourning and devotion, carried each year in processions that replay his martyrdom as though time itself bent around that wound. Martyrdom functioned as a guarantee. Those who died willingly for their gods would never really die. They became songs, paintings, festivals, processions. Their names endured where ordinary rulers and warriors faded into dust. The scarred, the burned, the executed, they were remembered not because they avoided destruction, but because they embraced it. In their willingness to offer themselves, they claimed a power over time that kings and generals rarely managed. And memory, of course, worked as social glue. Communities found in these deaths a rallying point, a shared story. The martyr was more than an individual. They became a kind of perpetual offering. Their body extended into the future through ritual remembrance, which is why martyrdom and sacrifice so often lived side by side with another notion, that blood, whether spilled in devotion or in punishment, could cleanse a people, soak up sin, and return the community to a state of uneasy purity. Blood has always been slippery, both pollutant and purifier, poison and medicine. In Levitical law, the spilling of animal blood was the ritual detergent for human sin, yet touching that same blood could render one unclean. The paradox was the point. What defiles in the street can sanctify on the altar. Sacrificial blood was treated like a mop that absorbed invisible filth, a divine cleaning fluid spread over communities to scrub away guilt. In ancient Greece, plague or famine could be explained as miasma, spiritual pollution that spread like a bad smell through the city. The cure was often violent, expelling scapegoats, stoning them, driving them into the sea. Their deaths rinsed the collective conscience, the body of one absorbing the corruption of many. Early Christians carried the same logic forward with new intensity. Christ's blood became the once-for-all cleanser, his execution not merely punishment but universal detergent, washing away not just one city's dirt but the entire world's. Elsewhere, the principle took stranger turns. In parts of Central America, voluntary bloodletting was believed to balance disorder by feeding chaos before it grew hungry enough to devour the whole community. Among the Aztecs, captives could be sacrificed not because they were wicked, but because they were useful containers for pollution sponges that absorbed imbalance and restored cosmic equilibrium. In some Pacific societies, menstruating women were isolated, not because they were despised, but because their blood was considered too potent, dangerous in its ability to over-cleanse, to scrub away the fragile balance of daily life. What unites these examples is the belief that the body can be weaponized against its own contamination. A slice of skin, a wound, a death could draw off the dangerous currents of sin, envy, disease, or misfortune. The body became both trash bin and purifier, a paradoxical tool that reminded people how close filth and holiness truly were. And once bodies were treated as sponges for sin, another possibility opened. They could also serve as vessels not only to soak up dirt, but to be filled with something greater, even divine. Which is why many cultures turned to altered states, to fasting, to ecstatic possession. The body didn't just absorb pollution, it could be emptied, then refilled, like a jar handed directly to the gods. Possession begins where the ordinary body ends, when fasting has hollowed the stomach, when sleeplessness has blurred the edges of thought, when pain has rung every nerve like a bell. The body becomes a doorway. In the Amazon, shamans drank brews so bitter they vomited until empty, then allowed spirits to move in through the vacancy. Among the Greeks, the Pythia at Delphi inhaled vapors until her speech broke into riddles, her mouth no longer hers, but a ventriloquized channel for Apollo. Such states weren't accidents. They were cultivated with surgical precision. Plains Indians pierced their skin and danced without food or water until visions arrived, the exhaustion itself functioning like an invitation. In Siberia, shamans shook until their limbs jerked out of human rhythm, their voices shifting into registers too low or too high for ordinary speech. Audiences believed the gods had settled into the vacant body, riding it like a borrowed horse. The irony is that what looked like loss of control was often a display of mastery. One had to train for possession fast for weeks, memorize chants, endure pain to make the body pliable enough to host something other than itself. The act was voluntary, even if the result appeared terrifying. To be seized by a god or ancestor wasn't humiliation, it was prestige. The body, so often cut, burned, or bled for sacrifice, was now elevated into an altar, animated by something far larger than human breath. And these states didn't just serve the individual. Communities gathered to watch, to listen, to tremble as the possessed revealed prophecies, warnings, or cures. The body became a communal oracle, its jerks and cries treated as messages the gods had handwritten in flesh. And of course, the lure of such states was more than social. For the one possessed, ecstasy was intoxicating, a sense of being cracked open and filled with thunder, of dissolving into something vast. It was terrifying, yes, but also seductive. If the gods could borrow your body for a night, perhaps they might also grant you passage beyond it. And so the final logic took shape. To give the body entirely was not simply to suffer, not even simply to host divinity. It was to step through the threshold into the afterlife itself, carrying the promise that the offering was never an end, but a continuation. Death, in this arrangement, was rarely the end. It was a wager, a bargain struck on the premise that flesh handed over here would secure permanence elsewhere. The Egyptians wrote this contract most explicitly: tomb walls, thick with spells, coffins, lined with prayers, all insisting that the body surrendered to the earth would rise again, transfigured, if the gods were properly fed with offerings of organs, limbs, even the embalmed whole. Death was a down payment on eternity. The Aztecs divided the afterlife like a tax ledger. Warriors who died in battle or captives sacrificed on altars were rewarded with a paradise of endless dawns, joining the sun on its journey. Those who died of disease or drowning wandered to different realms, less glorious, but still orderly. Voluntary sacrifice guaranteed placement in the best neighborhoods of the afterlife. Similarly, Norse sagas promised Valhalla to those who fell with a weapon in hand, their blood sealing entry into a hall where fighting and feasting never ended. The body, lost here, was exchanged for an upgraded one elsewhere. Martyrs knew the bargain well. In Christianity, the promise of resurrection and eternal communion turned execution into victory. Their spilled blood was less tragedy than ticket, stamped and valid for heaven. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, self-offering could accelerate karma's grinding wheel, burning off lifetimes of debt in one act of surrender, leapfrogging straight toward liberation. Even the gruesome practice of voluntary entombment, where monks sealed themselves alive underground, was framed as a conscious step into eternity. The afterlife treated not as a vague hope, but a destination chosen deliberately. Underlying it all was a consistent conviction: the gods weren't merely hungry for flesh, they were gatekeepers. To give up one's body was to grease the hinges of the cosmic door. The afterlife wasn't granted freely, it had to be negotiated, sometimes purchased in blood. And so, from scarification to immolation, from martyrdom to embalmed kings, humans wagered the only thing they fully owned. The body became a bargaining chip, slid across the table to immortal dealers, in hopes of winning what lay beyond sight.